Chapter 211. The success of the first motion picture sent ripples through Amarathia. Newspapers hailed it as the dawn of a new entertainment age, while investors poured money into the newly established film industry. But for Matthew Hesh, this was just the beginning. With the first film proving that cinema was not only possible but commercially viable, he knew what needed to come next: a grand historical epic, a film that would cement cinema as more than just entertainment. It had to be something meaningful. Something that showcased the power of storytelling, and what better story than Amarathia's own fight for independence? 2 days after the premiere, Matthew gathered his top executives, film directors, and historians at Hesh Studios, which had rapidly become the center of Amarathian filmmaking. The meeting was held inside the studio's main conference room. A simple yet modern space lined with blueprints, concept sketches, and maps of historical locations. Matthew stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the polished wood. "We're making a new film," he announced, "not just any film, but one that tells the story of Amarathia's birth, our break from the British Empire, and the establishment of our republic." A murmur of excitement ran through the room. David Calloway leaned forward, intrigued. "A historical war film?" Matthew nodded. "More than that, I want this to be the definitive account of our revolution. It's not just about battles, it's about the people, the decisions, the sacrifices that built this nation." Jacob Sinclair, the senior strategist, frowned slightly. "Sir, that's ambitious. War is difficult to film. We'll need large sets, costuming, and trained extras, not to mention, how do we depict massive battles without an actual war?" Matthew smirked. "Well, innovate." He turned to the head of special effects, Charles Hewitt. "Charles, we're going to need practical effects, explosions, battlefield smoke, cannon fire. Can we achieve that?" Hewitt rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It'll be tricky, but yes, we can use controlled pyrotechnics, blank cartridges for musket fire, and staged explosions using sandbags and flash powder. We might even be able to create fake cannon shots with compressed air." Matthew nodded. "Perfect." He then turned to scriptwriter Daniel Whitmore, one of the leading writers at Hesh Studios. "Daniel, I need the screenplay to be authentic. Work with historians, dig through records, and create a story that's as accurate as possible." Whitmore grinned, already jotting notes. "I've always wanted to write something like this. Who are the main figures?" Matthew glanced at the group before speaking. "We focus on General Thomas Caldwell, the leader of Amarathia's Revolutionary Army, and Ambrose Fairchild, the first president of Amarathia." Sinclair leaned forward. "Are you thinking of making it a war drama or a character-driven film?" Matthew thought for a moment before answering. "Both. We show the war, but we also show the political struggle, the divided opinions, the risks of rebellion. This isn't just about soldiers fighting, it's about the choices that led us to become independent." There were nods of agreement around the table. Calloway finally broke the silence. "Then let's get to work." Within days, the largest film production in Amarathian history was underway. First came the casting. Since cinema was still a new industry, many of the actors were former stage performers, but Calloway, with his keen eye for talent, found newcomers who had the look and presence to bring the historical figures to life. James Rowland was cast as General Thomas Caldwell, a rugged, authoritative presence who embodied the fierce leadership of Amarathia's rebellion. Frederick Dawson took on the role of Ambrose Fairchild, the intelligent yet cautious politician who guided Amarathia toward nationhood. Isabel Hathaway was cast as Eleanor Whitmore, a fictional composite character representing the women who played vital roles behind the scenes: spies, nurses, and revolutionaries. Once the cast was secured, historical accuracy became the next challenge. Matthew personally oversaw the recreation of 18th century Amarathia, using historical maps to design authentic villages, battlefields, and political halls. The costume department worked relentlessly to create accurate military uniforms, civilian clothing, and even the powdered wigs worn by the politicians of the time. On the outskirts of Amsterdam, the studio purchased a large plot of land to serve as the battlefield set. There, trenches were dug, wooden forts were constructed, and mock British encampments were built. Everything was as real as possible. Filming began with a dramatic opening sequence: the Boston Harbor Massacre, where British troops fired upon Amarathian merchants protesting unfair taxation. This required a large crowd of extras, stunt actors trained in falling and reacting to gunfire, and special effects teams creating realistic smoke and musket fire. Filming wasn't easy. Shots had to be coordinated perfectly, as practical effects were difficult to reset. One scene depicting General Caldwell's army ambushing British troops in the forests took 3 full days to perfect. Calloway stood behind the camera as Matthew observed from the director's tent. "Action." The Amarathian soldiers, played by stunt actors and trained extras, crouched behind trees, muskets at the ready. On cue, a line of British soldiers marched into view, their red coats standing out against the green backdrop. Then fire. The Amarathians unleashed their first volley, their muskets blazing with controlled blank fire. Smoke filled the air as the British soldiers reacted realistically, falling back in chaotic disarray. Calloway turned to Matthew, impressed. "It looks real." Matthew smirked. "It has to be." Filming continued for weeks, recreating battles, political debates, and even emotional moments between characters. One particularly powerful scene featured Ambrose Fairchild delivering a speech to the Amarathian Congress, convincing them to sign the Declaration of Independence. It was filmed in a massive replica of the original Congressional Hall, with actors portraying the divided representatives. The speech, delivered with booming conviction by Frederick Dawson, left even the crew members silent. When the final vote was cast and the declaration signed on screen, Matthew knew they had captured something truly special. Find more chapters on RanoVox.com. The grand premiere, a nation watches its story months later. The film was completed, titled Rebellion and Republic. It was a 3-hour historical epic that depicted the struggle, sacrifices, and triumphs that led to Amarathia's birth. The premiere was held in Hesh Grand Cinema, the largest theater in Amarathia. Government officials, historians, military veterans, and journalists filled the seats. Matthew sat beside Amber, who squeezed his hand as the lights dimmed. The film began. For the next 3 hours, the audience watched history unfold. The Boston Harbor Massacre shocked them, the battle sequences had them gripping their seats, the political debates brought murmurs of recognition, a reminder of the fragile moments that had shaped their country. And finally, as the film ended with the first Amarathian flag rising over the Capitol, the screen faded to black, silence, then thunderous applause. Amber turned to Matthew, smiling. "You did it." Matthew shook his head, watching as the audience rose to their feet, applauding, some even wiping away tears. "We did." Cinema had not just entertained, it had preserved history, and with that, Amarathia had found a new way to tell its story for generations to come. Chapter 2:12. The days following the premiere of Rebellion and Republic were nothing short of historic. Newspapers across Amarathia were flooded with glowing reviews, hailing the film as a masterpiece of storytelling and a defining moment in entertainment. Cinema had captured the imagination of the public like nothing before. By the end of its first week, Rebellion and Republic had grossed over 5 million florins, an unheard of sum in the entertainment industry. Every screening at Hesh Grand Cinema was sold out and lines wrapped around the block, with eager citizens waiting hours for a chance to see the revolutionary film. Even theaters in smaller towns, which had just begun installing cinema projectors, were seeing overwhelming demand. Matthew Hesh sat in his office at Hesh Corporation, a financial report spread out in front of him. He studied the numbers carefully. In just 3 weeks, ticket sales had doubled their initial investment in the film, and with international markets in Britain, France, and Japan expressing interest, the potential for revenue was staggering. David Calloway, head of the media division, entered the room with a wide grin. "Matthew, we're getting flooded with requests from theater owners across Amarathia. Everyone wants to show the film." Matthew leaned back, smirking. "I assume we're expanding distribution?" Calloway nodded. "We've already started. We're licensing the film to more cinemas, and even the rail companies want to set up small screening rooms in major train stations. People are willing to pay a premium just to see it." Matthew folded his hands. "Good. But this isn't just about one film. We need to capitalize on the momentum and expand the entire industry." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about building more cinemas?" Matthew nodded. "Exactly. If we want cinema to become the dominant form of entertainment, we need to make it accessible. Right now, only major cities have proper screening facilities. That has to change." Within a week, Matthew approved a massive investment to construct Hesh Cinemas, a chain of theaters dedicated to showcasing motion pictures across Amarathia. Architects and engineers worked around the clock, designing elegant but efficient cinema houses that could be built quickly and affordably without sacrificing luxury. Each theater would feature large screens designed specifically for motion pictures, state-of-the-art sound systems to enhance the audio experience, comfortable seating, arrangements modeled after opera houses, affordable ticket pricing, ensuring accessibility for all citizens. The first new Hesh Cinema was opened in Boston, and within a month, 3 more locations followed in Philadelphia, Charleston, and New Orleans. Every single one of them sold out their opening week. Read exclusive adventures at RanoVox. Calm beyond ticket sales, Matthew knew there were other revenue streams to explore. David, he said during a meeting with the media division, why aren't we selling film-related merchandise? Calloway hesitated. Merchandise? You mean like posters? Matthew smirked. Not just posters, everything, portraits of the lead actors, collectible booklets about the making of the film, even replica flags from Rebellion and Republic. If people love the story, they'll want to take a piece of it home. Calloway's eyes lit up. That could work. We could sell them inside the theaters, just like how they sell programs at live performances. Within days, a dedicated merchandising division was set up under Hesh Corporation. The results were astounding. Official film posters were sold in theaters, printing over 200,000 copies within a month. The film soundtrack, recorded using an orchestral score, became a best-selling record. Replica muskets and uniforms from the film became a surprise success, particularly among younger audiences. Revenue skyrocketed, bringing in millions more florins beyond just ticket sales. The influence of cinema stretched beyond just profits. Universities and historians praised Rebellion and Republic as a tool for education, helping Amarathian citizens connect with their history like never before. Schools began organizing field trips to cinemas, allowing students to experience history visually and emotionally. Even Amarathian politicians took notice. Senators and congressmen, initially skeptical of cinema's role in society, now viewed it as a powerful medium for shaping public perception and national identity. One journalist from the Amarathian Tribune wrote, "More than entertainment, cinema has become the voice of our generation, immortalizing our past and inspiring our future." Matthew knew they had accomplished something extraordinary, but he also knew that this was only the beginning. With the domestic market conquered, the next logical step was international expansion. Foreign dignitaries from Britain, France, and Japan had all expressed interest in screening Amarathian films. David Calloway brought the latest report to Matthew's office. The British and French are willing to negotiate licensing deals to show Rebellion and Republic in their theaters. Calloway said, the Japanese are also considering building cinemas of their own modeled after ours. Matthew smirked. Then let's move forward. We'll send projectionists and technical teams to help them set it up. The faster we expand, the harder it will be for anyone else to catch up. Calloway chuckled. I wouldn't worry too much about competition, Matthew. We're the only ones who know how to do this at scale. Matthew nodded. That was exactly the point. One evening, Matthew sat with Amber in their private quarters at the White House, a financial report in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other. Amber glanced at him. I take it things are going well? Matthew chuckled. Better than well. Cinema isn't just an experiment anymore, it's an empire. Amber smiled, rocking Maverick gently in her arms. So, what's next? More historical films. Matthew leaned back, thinking, historical films are good, but we need to branch out. People want adventure, romance, action. We need stories that take them places they could never go in real life. Amber smirked. You mean fiction? Matthew nodded. Yes, fiction. He took a sip of whiskey, already formulating his next move. Cinema had conquered history. Now it was time to create worlds that never existed. And with that, the future of Amarathian cinema was set in motion. This was going to be exhilarating for him. After all, he had propelled this country up to 50 years into the future. Chapter 213. The White House, early morning, June 1896. Matthew Hesh sat on the floor of the presidential study. His legs crossed as he held an illustrated book open in his lap. Across from him, 3-year-old Maverick sat on a plush rug, his chubby fingers resting on the pages. His small brows furrowed in concentration as he sounded out a word. Cacket? Maverick said slowly, looking up at his father with wide blue eyes. Matthew grinned. That's right, son, Cat. Good job. Amber, sitting beside them with a warm smile, tousled Maverick's blonde curls. You're getting better every day, sweetheart. Maverick beamed, kicking his little legs in excitement. Read more. Matthew chuckled. All right, how about this one? He pointed to an illustration of a steamship, plowing through the ocean waves. Can you try this word? Maverick stared at it, tilting his head. Shish ship. Amber clapped. That's right. Very good, Maverick. Before Matthew could turn the page, the door to the study swung open. Chief of Staff Henry Collins stepped inside, his expression tense. Mr. President, I apologize for the interruption, but you're needed immediately. Matthew's smile faded. The tone in Colin's voice sent a chill through him. Amber's grip on Maverick tightened slightly. What's wrong? Collins hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. A naval incident. The Spanish have sunk one of our frigates near Cuba. Matthew inhaled sharply, his mind raced. He glanced at Amber, who immediately knew what he had to do. She gently stroked Maverick's back. "I'll stay with him, go." Matthew stood, closing the book and giving Maverick one last look before turning to Collins. "Brief me on the way." The War Room White House. The room was alive with tension. New generals, admirals, and key government officials stood around a large naval map spread across the table, marking the waters near Cuba. The scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air from earlier discussions, and the weight of uncertainty hung over the gathered men. Matthew entered, his gaze sharp. "All right, someone tell me exactly what happened." Admiral Jonathan Wells, Chief of Naval Operations, cleared his throat. "Sir, last night, the Amarathian frigate USS Resolute was conducting a routine patrol just off the coast of Cuba. Without warning, a Spanish cruiser opened fire. The ship was hit multiple times before sinking. We've received confirmation there are no survivors." Silence. Matthew's jaw clenched. "How many men were aboard?" 87, sir," Wells answered grimly. A murmur spread through the room. Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair leaned forward. "This is an act of war, Mr. President. The Spanish fired upon one of our ships. Unprovoked. This cannot go unanswered." Matthew exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice steady. "Do we have any idea why they did this?" Wells shook his head. "None. The Spanish haven't made any public statements, and our intelligence reports no prior tensions that would justify such an action." Matthew frowned. It didn't make sense. The Spanish had their struggles, rebellions in Cuba and the Philippines, rising discontent in Madrid but outright attacking an Amarathian warship? That was suicidal. Sinclair slammed his fist on the table. "Sir, we can't let this slide. Our men were murdered. What are we supposed to tell their families? That we're going to sit back and wait for another attack?" Matthew held up a hand. "I am not dismissing this, Secretary, but I need to know why this happened before we start a war that will cost even more lives." Some in the room nodded, while others bristled at his cautious approach. One of the younger staffers, Secretary of the Navy Robert Alden, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, there is a possibility that this was an accident." "An accident?" Sinclair scoffed. "You think the Spanish accidentally sunk an entire warship?" Matthew studied the map. "Accidents do happen at sea. Misidentifications, faulty communications, overzealous captains. The Spanish are stretched thin right now. They're fighting uprisings in multiple territories. Their navy is exhausted. If one of their commanders panicked, fired without orders, we need to find out before we commit to war." Admiral Wells sighed. "Sir, even if it was an accident, it doesn't change the fact that our men are dead. We must respond." Matthew's expression darkened. He wasn't about to let Amarathian blood be spilled without consequence, but neither would he rush into a conflict blind. After a long pause, he made his decision. "Collins," he said, turning to his chief of staff, "send word to the Spanish ambassador. I want an emergency meeting today. I want to hear their explanation before we make our next move." Collins nodded. "Understood, sir." Matthew then faced his generals. "For now, put the military on high alert. Our fleets in the Caribbean are to maintain a defensive stance. No one moves without my direct order. Stay connected via Novelbin." Calm. Sinclair exhaled sharply. "And if the Spanish refuse to explain?" Matthew's voice was cold, firm. "Then they will answer in another way." The White House. Later that night, the crisis had consumed the entire day. Meetings, strategy discussions, messages sent back and forth between Washington and Madrid. But despite the growing tension, Matthew returned to his quarters that evening exhausted but composed. Amber was waiting for him, sitting in a chair near the window, rocking Maverick in her arms. The little boy was asleep, his small fingers curled into his mother's dress. Matthew loosened his tie, rubbing his forehead. "Any trouble getting him to sleep?" Amber shook her head. "No, he kept asking when you'd be back, though." Matthew exhaled and sat beside her. He reached out, brushing a hand over his son's soft curls. He looked so peaceful, So unaware of the storm brewing outside these walls, Amber studied him. It's bad, isn't it? Matthew met her gaze. A warship full of Amarathian sailors was sunk. The country wants retribution. She sighed, tightening her hold on Maverick. And what do you want? Matthew hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Did he want justice? Yes. Did he want war? No, but if Spain couldn't explain themselves, then Amarathia would have no choice. I want to know the truth, he finally said. Amber placed a hand over his. Then I hope you find it before it's too late. Matthew sat in silence for a long time, staring at his son. Tomorrow, the Spanish ambassador would arrive, and the course of history would be decided. Chapter 214. The White House morning, June 1896. The Spanish ambassador arrived at the White House just as the morning sun cast its first golden rays over Washington, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. Ambassador Luis de Montoro stepped into the conference room, his expression unreadable. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air charged with the weight of a decision that could send Amarathia and Spain into war. President Matthew Hesh sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by his closest advisors, Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair, Secretary of State Richard Alden, Admiral Jonathan Wells, and Chief of Staff Henry Collins. Across from them, Montoro took his seat, his two aides standing rigidly behind him. Matthew wasted no time. He leaned forward, his fingers laced together. Ambassador Montoro, thank you for coming on such short notice. I'm sure you're aware of why we've called this meeting. Montoro nodded, his face betraying nothing. Yes, Mr. President, the sinking of the USS Resolute near Cuba, an unfortunate incident. Sinclair scoffed. Unfortunate? 87 Amarathian sailors are dead. That's more than unfortunate. Montoro remained calm, unfazed by Sinclair's anger. I assure you, gentlemen, the Spanish government had no involvement in this attack. We were as shocked as you to learn of the sinking. Matthew narrowed his eyes. You're saying your Navy wasn't responsible? Montoro hesitated for a brief moment before shaking his head. At this moment, we have no confirmation that a Spanish warship intentionally fired on your frigate. Our forces in Cuba are under strict orders not to engage Amarathian ships. If this attack came from one of our vessels, it was not sanctioned by Madrid. A murmur spread across the Amarathian officials. Sinclair leaned forward. Then how do you explain it? Did one of your captains decide to go rogue? Montoro sighed. We are launching an internal investigation as we speak. If this was the act of a reckless commander, he will be punished accordingly, but I urge you, Mr. Presidento, not rush to war. Matthew studied the ambassador carefully. Everything in his demeanor suggested he was telling the truth. The Spanish government had no reason to provoke Amarathia. Their empire was already strained with revolts in Cuba and the Philippines. Starting another war with a rising power like Amarathia would be madness. Before Matthew could respond, the doors to the conference room suddenly burst open. A man in a dark navy uniform strode in confidently, flanked by two aides, his neatly combed hair and sharp features exuded the eagerness of ambition, and his eyes gleamed with something Matthew recognized all too well. Hunger. Mr. President, the man announced, ignoring all protocol as he walked straight toward the table. I have urgent information regarding the attack. Montoro scowled. Who is this? The man straightened his uniform, his tone dripping with self-importance. William Bradford, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Sinclair and Wells exchanged a glance. Bradford was young, brash, and fiercely imperialistic, one of the most vocal advocates for expanding Amarathia's influence. He had built a reputation within naval circles for his hawkish stance on foreign policy. Matthew leaned back in his chair, studying him. You have proof? Bradford nodded. We've intercepted communications from Spanish naval officers in Cuba, clear evidence that they intended to sink the USS Resolute. The room fell silent. Montoro's face darkened. That's impossible. We received no such orders from Madrid. Bradford smirked. Maybe not from Madrid, but it's clear that someone in your Navy wanted a war. Montoro slammed his palm on the table. This is an outrageous accusation. If such proof exists, then I demand to see it. Bradford reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a stack of documents. He placed them on the table, tapping the top page. Here it is, gentlemen, coded transmissions sent from Havana, translated and confirmed by our intelligence officers. Sinclair quickly grabbed the documents, scanning them with a furrowed brow. Wells leaned over his shoulder, reading alongside him. After a tense moment, Sinclair exhaled sharply. Damn it, these orders mention removing enemy ships near Cuba. Montoro's jaw tightened. That is not proof that we ordered an attack. Bradford crossed his arms. It's mighty convenient that this happened right after your fleet got those orders. Matthew, still silent, studied the documents. Something felt off. The phrasing was vague, the words could be interpreted in many ways. Nowhere did it explicitly say attack Amarathian ships. Matthew looked up at Bradford, who decrypted these transmissions. Bradford didn't hesitate, naval intelligence. Matthew nodded, his mind working rapidly. If Spain had truly ordered this attack, Madrid would be acting very differently. Instead, they were scrambling for answers. He turned to Montoro. You said you're investigating this internally? Montoro nodded firmly, yes, and I will personally ensure you receive our findings within the next 48 hours. Matthew turned to his officials. Then we will wait. No mobilization, no retaliation. We give Spain time to present their findings. Sinclair clenched his fists but nodded. Bradford, however, scowled. Mr. President, with all due respect, waiting is a mistake. This was a deliberate act of war. Amarathia should strike first, before Spain can prepare a response. Matthew's eyes hardened. I will not send Amarathian soldiers to die without knowing the full truth. Bradford's jaw tightened, his frustration barely contained. And what if Spain uses this investigation to buy time? To reinforce their positions in Cuba and the Pacific? We should be preparing for war now. Matthew's voice remained steady. We already are. Our fleet is on high alert. Our troops are ready, but we will not strike first. Bradford exhaled through his nose, clearly displeased, but said nothing further. Explore stories on Novelbin. Calm Montoro stood, adjusting his coat. Thank you for your patience, Mr. President. We will find the truth. Matthew nodded. See that you do. As Montoro left, the tension in the room lingered. Bradford turned to Matthew one last time. I hope, for our country's sake, you're making the right choice. Matthew didn't respond. Bradford gave a curt nod and exited, his boots clicking against the marble floor. As soon as the doors shut, Matthew exhaled sharply. Sinclair leaned in. Do you trust the Spanish to tell the truth? Matthew glanced at the documents again. I don't know, but something about this doesn't feel right. Wells sighed. And if they did order the attack? Matthew's gaze hardened. Then Amarathia will not hesitate to respond. For now, they would wait, but the pieces were already moving, and not all of them were in his control. Chapter 215. The White House evening, June 1896. The atmosphere in the presidential office was suffocating. The room, normally quiet aside from the rustling of papers and the soft crackle of the fireplace, was now filled with the anxious murmurs of Matthew Hesch's closest advisors. The gravity of the situation had settled like a heavy fog over Washington, and the entire nation was on edge. Matthew sat behind his desk, fingers steepled together, his mind racing. The 48 hours he had given Spain had passed, and now it was too late. Bradford had made his move. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy had gone behind his back, leaking classified documents to the Amarathian press. Newspapers across the country had published new evidence, allegedly proving that Spain had intentionally ordered the attack on the USS Resolute. The headlines were damning. Spanish betrayal. Orders found directing attack on Amarathian warship. Our sailors were murdered. War must be declared. The Spanish Empire has spilled Amarathian blood. We must strike back. Public outrage exploded. Overnight, cities erupted in protests, demanding vengeance. In Boston and New York, crowds gathered outside Spanish consulates, waving Amarathian flags and chanting for war. The pressure on Matthew was mounting. Sinclair slammed a newspaper onto Matthew's desk. There's no coming back from this, Mr. President. Matthew exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. He knew, the moment that article had hit the press, the public would accept nothing less than war. Admiral Wells stood, his posture rigid. With all due respect, sir, the people demand action. The entire country is looking to you to act. Matthew stared at the newspaper, the inked words screaming at him. He looked up. And what if the Spanish investigation proves otherwise? Sinclair folded his arms. It won't matter. The president's fingers curled into a fist. It matters to me. The room went silent. Sinclair sighed, rubbing his temple. Mr. President, I understand your caution. I do, but whether or not Madrid actually ordered the attack is irrelevant now. The people believe they did. If you hesitate any longer, you'll be seen as weak. Matthew's jaw tightened. Weakness. That word burned in his mind. The Spanish ambassador had promised a report, but the Amarathian people wouldn't wait for diplomacy, and neither would men like William Bradford. The cabinet room was filled with high-ranking military officials and senior government leaders, all awaiting the president's decision. Maps of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were spread across the table. Matthew entered, and the murmurs ceased. He didn't sit down, he remained standing, arms crossed, scanning the faces in the room. Before we begin, he started, his voice controlled but firm. Has Spain responded? Collins, his chief of staff, cleared his throat. Madrid has sent a brief message denying all responsibility. They claim the evidence presented by our government is falsified. Bradford scoffed, shaking his head. Of course they would deny it, they were caught. Sinclair leaned forward. The people don't care about Madrid's excuses, sir, they want action. Matthew took a deep breath. Then let's assume for a moment that we do go to war. What is our strategy? Admiral Wells stepped up, pointing to the map. Our primary target would be Cuba. It's their most valuable colony in the Americas. We strike their naval forces there, land troops, and force them to surrender. General Nathaniel Harrington of the Army nodded. We can have 50,000 men ready to deploy within 2 months. Bradford smirked, and while the Army handles Cuba, the Navy can sweep across the Pacific. We could seize the Philippines, Guam, and the Spanish Pacific Islands within months. Matthew's stomach twisted at the sheer eagerness in Bradford's tone. The man didn't want justice, he wanted conquest. What about casualties? Matthew asked. General Harrington sighed. Hard to say. The Spanish army is weak, but their navy still holds power in the Caribbean. If they reinforce their positions, it will be costly. And how long will the war last? Silence. Then Wells answered, if we do this right? Less than a year. Matthew closed his eyes briefly. He had wanted to avoid war, but that option was gone now. The people demanded blood, Congress would demand blood, and if he didn't act, the next president would. He looked up, prepare the war declaration. 2 days later, June 18, 1896, President Matthew Hesh stood before Congress. The chamber was filled to capacity, senators and representatives waiting in tense anticipation. Newspapers had already declared war. The only thing missing was his official approval. Matthew exhaled slowly before speaking. Read exclusive adventures at Novelbin. Come, fellow Amarathians, he began, his voice calm but resolute. We stand at a crossroads in history. The chamber fell into dead silence. The USS Resolute was attacked in what can only be described as an unprovoked act of aggression. 87 of our sailors were taken from us, fathers, sons, brothers, men who gave their lives in service to this nation. The murmurs grew. Matthew continued. I have sought diplomacy, I have waited for answers, and yet Spain has offered none. Their silence is an insult to the memory of the men we lost. A roar of approval came from the chamber. I did not seek war, but now war has come to us. We cannot, and will not, allow such an atrocity to go unpunished. Louder cheers. Matthew's hands gripped the podium. Therefore, I stand before you today to request a formal declaration of war against the Kingdom of Spain. The room erupted, thunderous applause, cheers, and chants of Amarathia. Amarathia echoed through the halls of government. It was done. The Spanish-Amarathian War had begun. As Matthew left the chamber, Sinclair walked beside him. You did the right thing, sir, he said. Matthew didn't respond because deep down, he wasn't sure. As he walked out of the Capitol, Bradford stood waiting for him. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy gave a small, victorious smirk. This is the start of something great, Mr. President. Matthew stopped, turning toward him. This is the start of war. There is nothing great about that. Bradford, undeterred, simply smiled wider. Well, see. Matthew walked past him. He had made his decision. Now history would judge him for it. Chapter 2:16. A day later, the sun had barely risen over Washington when the War Cabinet convened in the White House. Maps of the Caribbean and the Pacific covered the massive table at the center of the room, while stacks of intelligence reports and logistics plans lay scattered across the desks. The scent of coffee and ink filled the air, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of papers and the occasional muttering of officers poring over troop deployments. President Matthew Hesh took his seat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. The decision had been made. Amarathia was at war. Now it was time to prepare. Status update, Matthew ordered, his voice calm but firm. Admiral Jonathan Wells, the highest-ranking officer in the Amarathian Navy, straightened his posture and began, Mr. President, we've placed our Atlantic Fleet on full war readiness. The 1st and 2nd Naval Divisions are already en route to Cuba. We estimate that within 2 weeks, our battleships will be in position to begin operations against the Spanish fleet. General Nathaniel Harrington, commander of the Amarathian Army, followed. We have 50,000 troops mobilizing in Florida, ready to embark once naval superiority is secured. Our men are equipped, trained, and prepared for a landing operation. Additional forces are being mustered across the country, bringing our total wartime strength to 120,000 within the next 3 months. Matthew nodded but remained silent, his eyes scanning the maps in front of him. Bradford, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, smirked. This war will be over before the leaves start falling. Mr. President, we have the manpower, the industry, and the strategy. Cuba will fall within weeks, the Philippines soon after. Matthew's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Bradford was already thinking beyond the war plans. The Amarathian Strategy Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair tapped a document on the table. Our strategy relies on securing naval superiority. Spain's Caribbean fleet is outdated, but their positioning gives them an advantage. If we don't act quickly, they'll reinforce their defenses. Wells leaned forward. Our first move will be to block Havana and cut off Spanish supply lines. Once their fleet is neutralized, we proceed with the land invasion. Matthew interjected, and what about the Pacific? Wells cleared his throat. The Pacific Squadron has been ordered to mobilize toward Manila Bay. The Philippines is Spain's largest colony in Asia, and taking it will cripple their hold in the Pacific. We anticipate a decisive naval battle with their fleet stationed there. Matthew studied the map, taking a deep breath. It was all happening so fast. Bradford grinned. Mr. President, I suggest we send a formal ultimatum to the Spanish governor in Cuba demanding surrender. Once they refuse, we have justification for a full-scale assault. Matthew ignored him. How long before we can launch the first offensive? Harrington replied, with the Navy securing the seas, the first troops can land within a month. Matthew gave a single nod. Then let's get to work. War required guns, ships, and supplies, and Hesh Corporation was at the center of it all. Your next chapter awaits on Novelbin. Within days of the declaration of war, Amarathian factories had shifted into overdrive. Ammunition production tripled, naval shipyards worked around the clock, and arms manufacturers produced thousands of new rifles, cannons, and artillery shells daily. Hesh Corporation, already the largest industrial power in Amarathia, led the charge in wartime production. Matthew personally oversaw every aspect. During a visit to one of his shipyards in Norfolk, he watched as thousands of workers scrambled to complete 3 brand-new battleships, their massive steel hulls towering over the docks. The air was thick with the sound of hammers striking metal, the hiss of steam-powered machinery, and the constant calls of foremen directing their crews. A factory manager approached him. Sir, we're running at maximum capacity. We'll have 3 new warships ready within 2 months, and another 5 following that. Good, Matthew replied. Push the workers, but don't break them. This war will be won with industry as much as with soldiers. Even the railways were being transformed into military lifelines. Freight trains carried stockpiles of ammunition, food rations, medical supplies, and artillery from northern factories to southern ports, where troop transports awaited to carry them to war. Across Amarathia, young men flocked to recruitment centers eager to enlist. War fever had gripped the nation. Posters bearing the slogan, "Remember the Resolute," lined the streets, encouraging citizens to take up arms. Newspapers ran daily. Headlines showcasing the bravery of the first troops embarking for Cuba. General Harrington stood before a crowd of fresh recruits in Florida, addressing them with unwavering confidence. Men, you are the first wave, the first to step onto the beaches of Cuba. The first to drive the Spanish from our hemisphere. You are the sword of Amarathia. Cheers erupted. They wanted war. Matthew, watching from a distance, clenched his fists. They had no idea what war truly was. The Spanish response. Havana prepares for war. Meanwhile, in Havana, Cuba, the Spanish governor prepared for the inevitable. Despite Madrid's reluctance to acknowledge Amarathia's military strength, the officers stationed in Cuba knew what was coming. Amarathia had more men, more ships, more guns. Spanish General Miguel Ruiz paced inside the governor's palace, reading the latest intelligence reports. The Amarathians were coming. They outnumber us nearly 3-1, one of his officers reported. Ruiz clenched his jaw. Then we make them bleed for every inch of land. By the end of June, Amarathia's naval forces had arrived off the coast of Cuba. Massive warships, their guns loaded and ready, formed a blockade around Havana. The first shots of the war would soon be fired. Matthew stood in the White House war room, listening as telegraph updates arrived from the fleet. The waiting was over. Sinclair turned to him. Sir, do we give the order? Matthew looked at the map of Cuba. Everything was in place. He took a deep breath. This was it. Proceed. Boom. The first Amarathian shells slammed into Havana's defenses. The war had begun. Chapter 217. The thunderous roar of naval artillery shattered the stillness of the Caribbean dawn. Amarathia's dreadnought-class battleships, their massive steel hulls gleaming under the morning sun, unleashed barrage after barrage upon Havana's coastal fortifications. Smoke and fire erupted from Spanish defensive positions as Amarathian shells tore through stone walls, reducing them to rubble. On the deck of the USS Dominion, Rear Admiral Edward Langley peered through his spyglass, observing the devastation. Along the shoreline, Spanish artillery crews scrambled to return fire, their outdated muzzle-loading cannons struggling to keep pace with Amarathia's rapid-firing naval guns. Langley turned to his executive officer. Send word to the landing forces. We begin the assault within the hour. Down below, aboard armored troop carriers, thousands of Amarathian soldiers checked their rifles, adjusted their ammunition belts, and steeled themselves for combat, unlike the Spanish, whose forces were still reliant on single-shot rifles. The Amarathians were equipped with the latest in military technology: bolt-action rifles, repeating carbines, and water-cooled Maxim machine guns that could lay down a devastating wall of fire. The White House War Room, back in Washington, President Matthew Hesh sat in the war room, surrounded by his top military advisors. Telegrams from the front lines arrived every few minutes, providing updates on the invasion. "Sir," Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair reported, scanning the latest dispatch. "Our fleet has crippled Spanish coastal defenses. Admiral Langley has given the order. The landings are about to begin." Enjoy exclusive chapters from Novelbin. Matthew exhaled slowly. Casualties? Minimal so far. The Spanish are struggling to return fire. Their coastal guns are no match for our artillery, Sinclair replied. Assistant Secretary of the Navy William Bradford smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I told you this would be easy, Mr. President. Our military superiority is overwhelming." Matthew didn't respond, instead turning his attention back to the tactical maps spread before him. Havana was the key to breaking Spain's hold on Cuba. If they secured it, the rest of the island would follow. As the first wave of Amarathian landing boats approached the Cuban shoreline, Spanish Mauser rifle fire cracked through the air. Enemy troops dug into fortified trench networks, rained down bullets upon the incoming soldiers, but the Amarathians were ready. Suppressing fire, an officer bellowed on cue. Dozens of Maxim machine guns mounted on special landing barges opened fire. The deadly chugging of the weapons echoed across the beach as they raked Spanish defensive positions with relentless streams of bullets. The effect was immediate. Spanish riflemen ducked for cover, unable to match the sheer volume of fire. Then came the mortars. Amarathian artillery crews, positioned on naval support vessels, lobbed explosive shells into the enemy trenches, blasting entire sections apart. With the Spanish pinned down, Amarathian troops rushed forward, their bolt-action rifles at the ready. The first wave hit the beach, bayonets gleaming, boots splashing through the surf as they stormed the enemy positions. Among them was Captain Daniel Carter. Leading a company of Marines in the center of the assault, he fired his Springfield rifle, dropping a Spanish officer before taking cover behind a wrecked supply cart. "We need to take out that machine gun nest," a lieutenant shouted. Carter turned, spotting the enemy Hotchkiss gun dug into a sandbag position, spitting fire at his men. "Flanking maneuver. Move now," he barked. A squad of Amarathian troops darted left, weaving through the chaos before launching a coordinated assault on the Spanish position. A well-placed stick grenade silenced the enemy gun crew, sending debris flying. The Amarathians pushed forward, breaching the first defensive lines and forcing the Spanish into retreat. By midday, Amarathian troops had secured the beaches and begun advancing toward Havana itself. The city's defenders, now outgunned and outmaneuvered, retreated into urban positions, setting up barricades in narrow streets. The battle turned into brutal street-to-street combat. Amarathian machine gun teams set up positions along major intersections, laying down suppressing fire as infantry squads moved between buildings. The Spanish, refusing to surrender, fought fiercely, using sniper positions and hidden explosives to slow the Amarathian advance, but their resistance was futile. Amarathian artillery batteries moved into position overnight, pounded enemy strongholds with high explosive shells. Spanish defenses crumbled under the relentless bombardment. At the governor's palace, General Miguel Ruiz, his face grim with defeat, watched as Amarathian forces stormed the central square. "They're everywhere," one of his officers muttered. Ruiz knew it was over. His troops were outnumbered, outgunned, and demoralized. "I won't waste lives on a lost cause," Ruiz said at last. Minutes later, the Spanish forces in Havana surrendered. The moment the telegraph from Havana arrived, the White House erupted into celebration. Sinclair turned to Matthew, a triumphant smile on his face. "Sir, Havana has fallen. The Spanish have surrendered." Bradford grinned. "It's a glorious victory, Mr. President. Cuba is ours." Matthew, however, remained unmoved. He glanced at the latest casualty reports: over 7,500 Amarathian soldiers dead, thousands more wounded. "Glorious," Matthew muttered, setting down the paper. "Tell that to the families of the men who won it." Bradford waved a dismissive hand. "Sacrifices must be made for expansion, sir, and now we set our sights on the Philippines." Matthew met his gaze. "Cuba was necessary, but this war is not about expansion." Bradford smirked. "History will say otherwise. It is our manifest destiny to expand not only in our continent but beyond it." Matthew didn't answer. The war wasn't over, and deep down, He knew that Bradford had no intention of stopping here with Cuba secured. The Amerathian Pacific Fleet received orders to begin its advance toward the Philippines. Matthew stared at the map in his office, tracing a finger over the distant islands of Manila Bay. He had thought war with Spain would be swift, but now he saw the bigger picture. Bradford and the other imperialists saw this war as something more than justice. They saw it as an opportunity, and Matthew feared what they would do next. As the ships sailed toward the Pacific, he could only hope that this war wouldn't consume more than just Spanish territory. He feared it would consume Amarathia itself. Chapter 218. The Pacific Campaign. The invasion of the Philippines, July 1896. Amerathian forces mobilized for war in the Pacific with Cuba secured and Spanish forces surrendering en masse. Amarathia's war against Spain had entered its next phase. The victory in Havana had electrified the nation, bolstering support for the war effort. But in the halls of government, the focus had already shifted. The real prize was across the ocean, the Philippines. A Spanish stronghold in the Pacific, the archipelago was rich in resources, strategically valuable, and home to a growing anti-Spanish insurgency. The Amerathian war planners saw it as a critical target, a stepping stone to further power in Asia. President Matthew Hesh, however, saw it differently. He had authorized the war against Spain for justice, not conquest. But with Cuba under Amerathian control, voices like Bradford's had grown louder, pushing for total victory. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy had orchestrated this war, and now he wanted more. In a war cabinet meeting, Matthew sat at the head of the table as maps of the Philippines were unrolled before him. "Give me the latest status report," he ordered. Admiral Jonathan Wells cleared his throat. "Our Pacific Fleet is en route to Manila Bay. We expect to arrive within the next 2 weeks. Spanish naval forces in the area are significantly weaker than ours, but they won't go down without a fight." General Nathaniel Harrington, the Army's top commander, tapped the map. "The Philippines won't be like Cuba. We're dealing with dozens of islands, thick jungles, and an active native rebellion against the Spanish." Matthew leaned forward. "Can we work with the rebels?" Harrington nodded. "Possibly. They hate the Spanish, but they don't trust us either. They might see us as just another foreign invader." Bradford scoffed. "Who cares what they think? We take Manila, wipe out the Spanish garrison, and the islands will fall in line." Matthew's gaze darkened. "I care." Bradford smirked but said nothing. The Battle of Manila Bay. Amerathian Navy crushes the Spanish fleet on July 20, 1896. Amarathia's Pacific Fleet, consisting of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers, arrived outside Manila Bay. The Spanish fleet, outdated and under strength, had no choice but to fight at dawn. Amerathian naval gunners took their positions. Admiral Wells, standing aboard the USS Liberty, gave the order, "Fire." The first artillery shells shrieked through the air, slamming into Spanish warships anchored in the bay. Explosions rocked the coastline as fires erupted across the decks of enemy vessels. Spanish shore batteries fired back, but their shells fell short, splashing harmlessly into the water within 2 hours. The Spanish fleet was decimated. Their flagship, the Reina Cristina, was reduced to burning wreckage, its crew abandoning ship as Amerathian cruisers closed in for the kill. By mid-afternoon, Manila Bay belonged to Amarathia. The first phase of the invasion was complete. The land invasion. Amerathian troops stormed Manila with naval dominance secured. Amerathian forces began their landings along the coast. 30,000 Amerathian troops, armed with bolt-action rifles, artillery, and Maxim machine guns, disembarked from transport ships and moved toward Manila. Spanish forces, numbering barely 15,000 men, fortified the city, preparing for a last stand. The fighting was brutal. Spanish soldiers, desperate to hold their colonial capital, fought street by street. Amerathian machine gun teams established positions at major intersections, cutting down enemy reinforcements. Spanish snipers on rooftops targeted officers, forcing Amerathian troops to clear buildings room by room. A Spanish artillery barrage nearly wiped out an entire Amerathian battalion near the city center, but the outcome was inevitable. After 3 days of fierce combat, the Amerathian flag was raised over Manila. The Spanish governor surrendered. Victory, but what next? Back in Washington, the news of the fall of Manila sent shockwaves across the country. Celebrations erupted in every major city. Amarathia had won. Matthew Hesh sat in the Oval Office, reading the latest reports. The war was practically over. Yet a new debate had begun. What would Amarathia do with the Philippines? Sinclair entered the room, setting a file on his desk. Sir, the Senate is already discussing what happens next. Many believe we should annex the islands permanently. Matthew exhaled. And what do you think? Sinclair hesitated. I think if we don't take them, someone else will. Britain, Japan, even Germany, they'd all love to claim the Philippines. Matthew rubbed his temple. The Spanish were beaten, but now Amarathia faced a new dilemma. Bradford's plan, Amarathian Empire? Enjoy new tales from Novelbin. Calm. The next day, Bradford stormed into Matthew's office uninvited, a triumphant grin on his face. Mr. President, we can't stop here. Matthew looked up, unamused. Excuse me. Bradford slapped a map of the Pacific onto his desk. The Philippines is just the beginning. Amarathia has the most powerful military in the region now. We should expand further. Guam, the Carolines, the Marianas, maybe even China. Matthew's expression hardened. That's not why we went to war. Bradford's smile didn't fade, isn't it? The people support expansion. The economy is booming. The military is stronger than ever. Why stop now? Matthew stood, eyes locked onto Bradford. Because I won't turn Amarathia into an empire. Bradford chuckled. That's too bad, Mr. President, because Congress might decide that for you. He turned and walked out, leaving Matthew staring at the map. The war was over, but the battle for Amarathia's future had just begun. July 25, 1896. The White House, Washington, D.C. The celebrations across Amarathia were thunderous. The victory in Manila had electrified the nation, with newspapers printing bold headlines like, Amarathia triumphs in the Pacific, Spanish rule ends in the Philippines. A new era for Amarathia begins. From Havana to Manila, our nation's destiny unfolds. Yet, inside the White House, Matthew Hesh sat in his office, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The war had been swift, brutal, and absolute. Amarathia had crushed Spanish forces in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, proving its military superiority, but winning the war was the easy part. Now he had to decide what kind of nation Amarathia would become. Sinclair, the Secretary of War, walked into the office holding the latest military report. Sir, Spanish officials in Madrid have reached out. They're asking for peace negotiations. Matthew sighed, setting down his pen. What terms are they proposing? Sinclair smirked. They're offering to surrender everything. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. They know they can't hold them anymore. Matthew leaned back. And what does Congress say? Sinclair hesitated. They want all of it. Matthew exhaled sharply. Of course, they do. Chapter 219. August 1896. Washington, D.C. The war had been won, but peace was yet to be secured. President Matthew Hesh sat in the White House cabinet room, surrounded by his closest advisors. The once booming war room, filled with military strategies and troop movements, now served as the nerve center for Amarathia's diplomatic future. The message from Madrid lay on the table before him, officially acknowledging Spain's surrender and requesting peace negotiations. Matthew exhaled, rubbing his temple. It's time to end this. Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair nodded. They don't have a choice. We've shattered their forces, taken their colonies, and humiliated them on the world stage. Across the table, Secretary of State Richard Alden looked over the diplomatic documents. They're desperate to negotiate, but we shouldn't expect them to surrender everything willingly. Admiral Jonathan Wells, commander of the Amarathian Navy, tapped his fingers on the table. They know they can't hold Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines. The real question is, how do we make sure they never threaten us again? Matthew leaned back. We dictate the terms. They will sign whatever we put in front of them. Bradford, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, smirked. Then let's not waste time. We need to press our advantage. Sinclair slid a document forward. We need a negotiating team in Madrid within a week. We'll need diplomats, military representatives, and economic advisors. Alden should lead it. Matthew nodded. Alden, assemble your team. I want ironclad terms. Spain will not have a chance to return as a threat. Alden inclined his head. Understood, Mr. President. August 10, 1896, Madrid, Spain. The Amarathian delegation arrived under heavy security, escorted by armed guards. Spain was in turmoil, its government in shambles. Its people furious over the loss of its empire. Protests erupted outside the royal palace, where the negotiations were to be held. Spanish citizens raged against their government. furious at the humiliation their country had suffered. Inside the palace, Alden and his delegation faced Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Soriano and his top ministers. Soriano looked exhausted, his face pale as he greeted the Amarathians. Alden wasted no time. "Gentlemen, you requested peace. Here are our terms." A thick folder was placed before Soriano. His hands trembled as he opened it. The Amarathian terms of surrender: Spain will formally cede Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to Amarathia. Spain will withdraw all military forces from these territories within 60 days. Spain will renounce any future claim to these territories. Spain will pay war reparations of 150 million florins. Amarathia will allow safe passage for Spanish civilians and officials evacuating the territories. Soriano swallowed hard. "You are asking us to give up everything." Alden didn't blink. "You've already lost everything." Soriano looked to his ministers, then back at Alden. "You must understand, this treaty will destroy Spain. Our people will never accept it." Alden folded his arms. "Then tell them this is the cost of war." Silence hung in the room. The Spanish ministers huddled together, whispering frantically. Eventually, Soriano spoke again. "We request a reduction in reparations. Our economy is on the brink of collapse." Alden's face remained stone cold. "Not a single florin less." Soriano sighed, knowing there was no negotiating from weakness. "Then at least allow Spain access to Manila's trade routes. We have relied on Asian markets for centuries." Alden considered it. "We will grant limited commercial access to Manila under Amarathian oversight." More hushed discussion followed. Finally, Soriano sighed in defeat. "Spain accepts." August 15th, 1896. In a grand ceremony at the Royal Palace, the Treaty of Madrid was signed on one side of the table, Prime Minister Soriano and his ministers, their faces filled with resentment and humiliation. On the other, Richard Alden, representing Amarathia's interests. The world watched as Soriano reluctantly picked up his pen and signed away Spain's colonial empire. The war was over. Spain, once a global superpower, had been reduced to a second-rate nation. August 20th, 1896. The White House, Washington, D.C. The treaty arrived in Washington 5 days later. Matthew sat in the Oval Office, staring at the official document. Sinclair stood beside him. "This is it, sir. The moment Amarathia becomes a true world power." Matthew sighed. "We didn't start this war to become an empire." Sinclair shrugged. "That doesn't change the reality. Discover hidden content at Novelbin." Calm across the room, Bradford grinned. "We have unmatched naval power, new territories, and an economy that will boom. This is the start of a new Amarathia." Matthew clenched his jaw. "This is the end of a war, nothing more." Bradford leaned in, voice dripping with satisfaction. "Congress doesn't see it that way. The people don't see it that way." Matthew took a deep breath. He had never wanted conquest. He had never wanted expansion. But the world had changed, and so had Amarathia. With a slow, deliberate motion, he signed the treaty. The moment the treaty was signed, Amarathia's future was altered forever. Newspapers declared Amarathia's dominance. Amarathia seizes victory, a new power rises. From Havana to Manila our nation's reach expands. The empire of Amarathia? Across Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, Amarathian troops took formal control, raising their flag over Spanish forts and palaces. The world had taken notice. Britain sent diplomats, eager to establish stronger ties. Japan watched Amarathia's expansion with interest and concern. Germany expressed displeasure at Amarathia's growing influence in the Pacific. Inside Amarathia, Congress debated the future. Some wanted full annexation of the new territories. Others pushed for independence movements. And then there was Bradford. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy had orchestrated this war from the shadows. And he wasn't done yet. In a private meeting, he approached a group of senators, holding a new map of the Pacific. "We have control of the Philippines," he whispered. "But why stop there? Guam, the Carolines, the Marianas, even China." His ambitions knew no limits. Amarathia had won the war. But now, a new battle was beginning, the battle for what kind of nation Amarathia would become. However, that Matthew himself really wanted? Because as of right now, He is satisfied with the territory that he had gotten prior to the war. Chapter 220. The ink had barely dried on the Treaty of Madrid, but the war drums had not yet stopped beating, even as Amarathia celebrated its decisive victory over Spain. A new debate consumed the halls of government. What now? President Matthew Hesch sat in his office, surrounded by maps, documents, and reports detailing the administration of Amarathia's newly acquired territories, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, each a prize taken from a crumbling Spanish empire, each presenting its own unique challenges. Outside, Washington buzzed with activity. The war had propelled Amarathia to the forefront of global power, and the streets were alive with patriotic fervor. Flags waved on every corner. Bands played triumphant. Marches and newspapers declared Amarathia's rise as a dominant force in the world, yet within the White House, the mood was far less celebratory. Seated across from him were his closest advisors: Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair, Secretary of State Richard Alden, Admiral Jonathan Wells, and Chief of Staff Henry Collins. The discussion was heated, as it had been for days. Sinclair was the first to speak. "Mr. President, we need to make a decision. Congress is moving fast. They want full annexation of all newly acquired territories." Matthew leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Do they understand what that means?" Alden interjected. "They don't care, sir. They see this as an opportunity to expand Amarathia's influence permanently." Matthew's gaze hardened. "This war was fought for justice, not empire. We retaliated for the attack on the USS Resolute. We destroyed Spain's hold in the Caribbean and the Pacific. That was the mission." Bradford, leaning against the far wall with his usual smirk, finally spoke. "Mr. President, with all due respect, the mission changed the moment we won." Matthew's jaw tightened. "I don't remember asking for your opinion, Bradford. Continue reading at Novelbin." Calm Bradford ignored the jab, stepping forward. "Sir, I've been meeting with influential senators over the past week. There's overwhelming support for keeping the Philippines. We need it as a strategic base. Without it, we can't compete in the Pacific." Matthew studied him carefully. "Compete with whom?" Bradford's smile widened. "Britain, Japan, Germany. Heck, even China. They're all watching us closely, and if we step back now, they'll fill the void. Are you willing to let that happen?" A long silence filled the room. The fate of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Matthew tapped his fingers on the desk. "Let's go over our options." Sinclair nodded and opened a folder. "We have 3 primary courses of action. Full annexation. Amarathia absorbs Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines into its territory permanently. They would become Amarathian holdings, governed directly by Washington. Protectorate status. Amarathia maintains military and economic control, but allows local governments to operate under Amarathian supervision. Independence. Amarathia withdraws and grants independence to the territories, either immediately or after a transition period." Matthew exhaled. "Cuba and Puerto Rico. Hat's the situation there?" Alden adjusted his glasses. "Cuba is in better shape than the Philippines. The Cuban rebels fought alongside us against the Spanish, and many of them expect independence." Sinclair added, "We could install a friendly government there and maintain influence without outright ruling them." Matthew nodded. "And Puerto Rico?" "Puerto Rico has no strong independence movement, unlike Cuba," Alden explained. "It's small, easy to manage, and would make an excellent naval station." Matthew turned to the map of the Philippines. "And Manila?" Wells cleared his throat. "Sir, the Philippines is a different story. It's a massive archipelago, thousands of islands, millions of people. They don't see us as liberators." Matthew's expression darkened. "So if we stay, we fight a new war?" Sinclair nodded grimly. "Possibly, sir." Bradford leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Then we crush the resistance before it begins." Matthew's stomach turned at the coldness in his voice. Bradford continued, "If we withdraw, Japan or Germany will take the Philippines within a decade. This is our one shot to establish Amarathia as the dominant power in the Pacific." Matthew took a deep breath, weighing the options. The debate in the White House was nothing compared to the firestorm in Congress. Senators and representatives were divided. Some demanded annexation. Others insisted on granting independence. The pro-expansion camp, led by men like Bradford, argued that Amarathia's future lay in overseas empire. The world has changed, one senator declared on the floor. Amarathia has become a great power. If we do not seize this moment, we will never get another. Opponents, however, warned of the dangers. We fought Spain to defend our people, not to become a colonial overlord. Another senator countered. Newspapers fueled the debate. Editorials and political cartoons flooded the press, depicting Amarathia either as a noble liberator or a ruthless imperialist. Public opinion was split. Many celebrated the victory, but not all wanted to rule foreign lands. Finally, after days of debate, Matthew called a final meeting. "I've made my decision." The room fell silent. Cuba will be granted independence under an Amarathian-backed government. Puerto Rico will become an Amarathian territory. The Philippines will remain under Amarathian administration for now, with plans for gradual self-governance. Sinclair nodded in approval. "That's a balanced decision, sir." Bradford grimaced, but Matthew cut him off before he could object. "This is final. We are not an empire. We will not rule people who do not want to be ruled, and there is no economic benefit in integrating them to our country, as they will be an additional expense. We already got many of them when we won during the war against Colombia. I am not going to get greedy and lose everything that we have gained for nothing." Bradford's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "As you say, Mr. President." Congress ratified the treaty, and Amarathia officially took control of its new holdings. Cuba's provisional government was established. Preparing for independence within 5 years, Puerto Rico became an Amarathian territory, with new naval bases under construction. The Philippines remained under Amarathian rule, but resistance movements began forming in the shadows. But within Amarathia itself, Bradford and his allies were not done. Behind closed doors, they plotted their next move. "We have the Philippines," he whispered to his supporters. "Now we just need the right excuse to expand further." Amarathia had won its first great war. But another battle loomed, one not fought with guns and ships, but with ideals, ambition, and the very soul of the nation itself.